When she died, he did not collapse. Grief did not slow him, it sharpened him. Death had taken what defined his world, and he refused to accept that theft as final. While others mourned, he fixated. If music could bend crowds, calm beasts, and silence kings, then it could reach further. He did not pray. He did not ask permission. He decided that the underworld would hear him, whether it wished to or not. The descent was not guided by light or divine escort. It was deliberate and solitary. He crossed into shadow without ritual, without blessing. The air thickened. Sound thinned. The world of the living faded behind him like a dismissed memory. Still, he continued. Obsession does not calculate risk once it selects a target. He was not entering the underworld in hope. He was entering it in defiance of finality itself. The river lay before him, black and slow, reflecting no sky. Karen did not speak at first. Few living men stood on that shore willingly. Orpheus did not plead. He lifted his instrument instead. The first note did not echo, it sank. The second lingered. The third began to move the current itself. Even the ferryman felt the shift. This was not mourning, this was intrusion. The boat carried him across waters that did not ripple naturally. Shadows moved beneath the surface without form. He did not look down. He played. Each note stretched forward into darkness, mapping space no living breath should occupy. The music did not comfort the dead. It unsettled them. Chains loosened. Whispers paused. The underworld, accustomed to silence, felt something it had not felt in ages: interruption. Cerberus stood at the gate, massive and still, three heads alert to intrusion. Orpheus did not reach for weapon or shield. He stepped closer. The melody shifted, lower, slower, deliberate. One head growled, another listened, the third lowered gradually. The beast did not collapse. It yielded, not out of affection, but because the sound rewrote the moment. No blade could have opened that gate. Music did. Beyond the gate, the landscape widened into fields of muted grey where forms drifted without weight. Faces half remembered, voices half finished. He did not stop to search. He knew what he sought. Obsession narrows vision until nothing else exists. The music grew sharper, cutting through fog like a blade through cloth. Even the damned turned toward him. The living did not belong there, yet he advanced as if he did. The halls of Hades did not tremble. They absorbed sound like stone absorbs cold. Thrones carved from shadow rose at the far end, and upon them sat authority untouched by grief. Orpheus did not kneel. He played. The melody no longer pleaded. It demanded attention. The notes carried memory, sunlight, breath, warmth. For the first time in ages, the underworld felt the weight of something it could not contain. Hades did not interrupt him. Persephone did not look away. The music unfolded slowly, deliberately, pulling images of the living world into a realm built on absence. Warmth entered cold chambers. Memory entered permanence. Even stone seemed to hesitate. When the final note settled, silence did not return immediately. It lingered, suspended between refusal and concession. Hades spoke without raising his voice. No anger, no mockery, only condition. She could follow him back to the world of breath and light. One rule: he must walk ahead. He must not look back until both stood fully beneath the sun. No exceptions, no reassurance. Orpheus did not question it. Obsession rarely examines the terms it believes it can control. He turned without searching for her eyes. The first step away from the throne felt heavier than the descent itself. Behind him, there was no sound of footsteps, no breath, no fabric brushing stone. Only silence. Silence thick enough to distort thought. He continued playing, softer now, as if guiding something fragile through darkness. Obsession trusts its own certainty more than it trusts silence. The corridor back felt longer than the path down. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward him. Every echo sounded like absence disguised as movement. He kept his gaze forward, fixed on the faint suggestion of light ahead. Doubt did not shout. It whispered. What if she was not there? What if the silence meant failure? Obsession thrives on control, and silence is the one element it cannot command. With each step, the silence thickened until it felt deliberate. He strained to hear even the faintest trace of breath behind him. Nothing. Not a footstep, not a whisper. The music in his hands faltered for the first time since the descent began. Obsession depends on certainty, and certainty was dissolving. The thought entered uninvited. Perhaps he had been deceived. The faint outline of the exit appeared ahead, pale and distant. Light filtered through the cavern mouth like a promise not yet fulfilled. He was close enough to believe the bargain had held, yet doubt sharpened instead of easing. What if she had stumbled? What if the gods had changed their minds? Obsession does not fear danger, it fears uncertainty. His steps slowed. The music stopped entirely. The silence behind him grew unbearable, expanding until it felt louder than any scream. He could feel the edge of sunlight touching his face. Just a few more steps, just forward. Yet the need to confirm, to see her, to prove she followed, began to overpower obedience. Obsession demands evidence. He turned, not fully, not dramatically, just enough. And in that fraction of movement, the condition shattered. For a single heartbeat, he saw her, real, reaching, almost returned. Then the light withdrew from her form, like breath leaving lungs. She did not scream, she did not accuse, she receded. And this time the underworld did not negotiate. The echo of his turn lingered longer than her image. Where she had stood, there was now only distance collapsing inward. He lunged forward, but the threshold had already sealed itself. The light remained ahead. The darkness reclaimed what belonged to it. No second bargain was offered. Obsession had miscalculated by a single glance, and the price was immediate, irreversible. He called her name once. The sound did not travel far. It dissolved before reaching depth. No response followed, not a whisper, not a shadow shifting in reply. The certainty that had fueled his descent fractured completely. He had bent beasts, ferrymen, and kings of the dead. Yet he could not restrain his own doubt for a single moment. Obsession had defeated itself. He did not rage at the gods. Rage implies surprise. He understood exactly what had happened. The rule had been clear. The failure had been his. That clarity did not soften the impact. It deepened it. He had come farther than any living man dared, had bent the architecture of death itself, and lost everything not through force but through a fraction of uncertainty. The ascent back into daylight felt heavier than the descent had ever been. The air of the living world returned, but it did not revive him. Sunlight touched his face, yet warmth did not register. He had breached death and returned alone. That isolation carried more weight than grief ever had. Obsession had driven him downward. Emptiness escorted him back. Those who saw him return expected triumph. They were met with silence instead. He did not speak of thrones, bargains, or shadows. He carried the moment inward, replaying it with relentless clarity. The turn, the glance, the loss. It had not been fate. It had not been deception. It had been doubt introduced for less than a second. Obsession had taken him into death itself, but doubt had undone everything it built. He did not attempt a second descent, not because the gates were closed, but because certainty was gone. Obsession survives on belief in control. That belief had cracked. The underworld had not overpowered him. It had exposed him. Exposed the fracture between confidence and proof. He had needed to see. That need had cost everything. Now he understood something worse than loss. He understood his own limit. The music changed after that. It no longer commanded, it remembered. Each note carried absence instead of persuasion. Those who heard him felt something colder than grief. They felt inevitability. He had proven that death could be negotiated, but not controlled. And control had been the hidden desire beneath his devotion. Without it, obsession had nowhere left to descend. He withdrew from celebration, from court, from applause that once followed every performance. Praise sounded hollow now. What is admiration beside irreversible absence? He had confronted the architecture of death and lost not to force, but to a flicker of uncertainty. That realization haunted him more than the darkness ever had. He could bend the world with sound, but he could not silence doubt within himself. People said he was brave to descend. They did not understand that bravery was never the driving force, refusal was. He had refused finality, refused silence, refused the idea that loss could not be reversed, but refusal without discipline collapses at the first fracture. In that single glance backward, obsession revealed its weakness. It demanded certainty instead of trusting the path forward. The world resumed its rhythm around him, indifferent to the war he had waged against death itself. Seasons changed, markets reopened, laughter returned to streets. Yet he moved through it as if displaced from his own life. He had crossed a boundary few dared imagine and returned altered. Obsession had carried him into the deepest darkness, but it could not protect him from himself. He stopped playing for crowds. When he lifted the instrument now, it was not to command attention, but to confront memory. The melodies grew thinner, sharper, less forgiving. They no longer tried to persuade the world. They exposed it, exposed the fragility of certainty, exposed the cost of needing proof. Those who listened felt unease because his music no longer promised salvation. It carried warning. Rumors began to follow him. Some said he had angered the gods beyond forgiveness. Others said he had been tested and found incomplete. He corrected neither version. Explanation would not restore what was lost. He understood now that the underworld had not defeated him with force. It had waited for the smallest crack in his resolve. That crack had been doubt, and doubt had required only a heartbeat. He began to understand something colder than grief. It was not the gods who had set the trap. It was the condition itself. Walk forward. Do not look back. The rule had been simple because obsession complicates what discipline keeps clear. He had mistaken proximity for completion, mistaken silence for absence, and in that mistake, he revealed the truth he had refused to face. Love had turned into control. Control had always been the hidden thread beneath his devotion. He believed he could outplay finality, bend inevitability, negotiate with silence itself, and for a moment, he had. The ferryman yielded, the beast yielded, even the throne had yielded. But obsession collapses when it demands confirmation. In turning, he sought proof instead of trust. That single need dismantled everything he had forced into alignment. He could still hear the final note that faded in the throne room, not the melody itself, but the silence that followed it. That silence had been possibility. He had walked through it with absolute confidence, and then he fractured it himself. The memory replayed without mercy. If he had taken one more step, if he had trusted one breath longer, obsession now fed on regret instead of resolve. Regret is quieter than grief, but far more corrosive. Grief mourns what was taken. Regret replays what could have been prevented. He did not blame the gods because he could not escape the clarity of his own action. The rule had been simple. The path had been clear. He had broken it himself. That awareness stripped obsession of its heroism and left it exposed as impatience disguised as certainty. He no longer descended toward the underworld, but he never fully returned to the living either. His body moved through daylight, yet his thoughts remained suspended at the threshold where he had turned. That moment became an anchor, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise. A single decision, measured in less than a breath, had rewritten everything. Obsession had always believed scale determined power. It had underestimated timing. He began to understand that the underworld had not humiliated him, it had measured him. The bargain was never designed to trap him with complexity, but to test restraint. Walk forward. Do not look back. The simplicity was intentional. Obsession fails not because it lacks power, but because it demands confirmation. In turning, he proved he needed proof more than he trusted process, and that need dismantled everything he had forced into alignment. After that realization, Something in him cooled permanently. The descent had been fire, refusal, confrontation. The return was colder. He no longer believed he could bend structures greater than himself. The underworld had not defeated him with force. It had revealed the one weakness obsession refuses to acknowledge, impatience disguised as urgency. That recognition did not free him. It restrained him more effectively than any chain below ever could. He withdrew further from those who once admired him. Their praise felt misplaced, almost offensive. They saw the man who had walked into death and returned. They did not see the fracture that followed him back. Obsession had promised victory but delivered exposure. Exposure of doubt. Exposure of control masquerading as love. That exposure reshaped him more than loss itself. The descent had been dramatic. The aftermath was precise and enduring. He stopped searching for ways to descend again, not because the path was impossible, but because repetition would not erase the flaw. The condition had been clear. The failure had been singular. Attempting again would not transform impatience into discipline. Obsession often believes intensity can compensate for weakness. It cannot. Weakness must be understood before it can be restrained. And understanding now weighed heavier on him than grief ever had. The world continued to call him gifted, powerful, unmatched. Titles meant nothing now. Power had been proven insufficient against a moment of internal fracture. He had moved rivers of shadow and silenced beasts of iron will, yet he could not silence the question that formed in that corridor. Was she truly there? That single doubt had outweighed every triumph below. And once doubt outweighs conviction, obsession begins to collapse inward. He began to see that love had not vanished in the turning. It had shifted shape. What he lost in the corridor was not only her presence, but his illusion of control over outcome. He had believed devotion could override structure, that intensity could substitute discipline. The underworld had answered without anger. It had simply enforced the rule. And in that enforcement, it stripped obsession of its certainty and left him facing himself without defense. Memory sharpened instead of fading. He could recall the exact angle of light at the threshold, the weight of silence pressing against his back, the tension in his hand before it moved. That precision made the loss inescapable. It had not been chaos. It had been calculation interrupted by doubt. Obsession thrives on forward motion. It weakens when asked to trust what cannot be seen. In that corridor, trust failed before love did. He realized the gods had not mocked him. They had respected him enough to give him a fair condition. Walk. Do not look back. Nothing hidden. Nothing ambiguous. The cruelty, if it could be called that, was simplicity. Obsession prefers complexity, because complexity offers room to negotiate. Simplicity offers only obedience. In breaking that simplicity, he confronted a truth harsher than loss. Discipline, not devotion, was the missing element. He understood now that the descent had been easier than the return. Going downward required courage and intensity. Walking forward without reassurance required restraint. Courage he possessed in abundance. Restraint he did not. The underworld had not required strength from him. It had required patience. And patience is the one virtue obsession rarely cultivates. That imbalance, exposed in a single turn, had undone everything his power had achieved. He no longer blamed darkness for what happened. Darkness had followed the agreement precisely. It was his own impulse that broke formation. That distinction mattered. It prevented bitterness from replacing clarity. The failure was internal, not external. Obsession had carried him into depths no one else would dare approach, yet it could not restrain the instinct to verify. In seeking confirmation, he forfeited completion. The memory of her reaching stayed with him longer than her voice ever had. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just a gesture interrupted. That interruption became the axis of his life. Everything before it felt driven. Everything after it felt measured. He had learned that power can open gates, but it cannot rush fulfillment. Fulfillment demands discipline sustained through silence, and silence had been the one element he could not endure. He began to understand that obsession had always mistaken motion for progress. Moving towards something does not guarantee arrival. Arrival requires adherence to structure, especially when structure feels unbearable. The rule had not been cruel, it had been precise. In turning, he violated precision, not love. That distinction reshaped his grief. It was no longer about death. It was about discipline, abandoned one step too soon. He avoided places that echoed too clearly, open fields, stone corridors. Anywhere silence could stretch behind him. Silence now carried accusation. It reminded him that trust requires forward movement without visible assurance. He had demanded certainty instead. That demand had cost him everything. Obsession often claims it is stronger than fear, yet in that corridor, fear of emptiness proved stronger than his devotion, and that imbalance defined the rest of his life. He understood now that the gods had not tested his love. They had tested his endurance within uncertainty. Love had carried him downward without hesitation. Uncertainty had accompanied him upward without comfort. In that narrow corridor between darkness and light, he had faced the only opponent that could undo him, the absence of confirmation. Obsession can endure pain. It struggles to endure silence, and silence was all that surrounded him in the final steps. He stopped trying to rewrite the moment. For a time he had imagined alternate endings, one more step, one more breath, one more measure of patience. But imagination could not alter structure. The condition had been clear, and he had broken it. Accepting that fact did not heal him, it clarified him. Obsession had once defined his strength. Now clarity defined his restraint. The difference between them was discipline earned too late. He realized that what he had lost in the underworld was not merely her presence, but the illusion that intensity guarantees outcome. Intensity opens doors. It does not complete journeys. Completion requires obedience to structure, even when structure feels unbearable. In that final corridor, obedience would have been simple. Forward, only forward. Yet obsession demanded visibility. That demand fractured discipline and converted possibility into permanent absence. In time, others romanticized his descent. They spoke of courage, devotion, unmatched resolve. They rarely spoke of the turn. The turn was less dramatic than the journey, yet far more decisive. It proved that power can challenge death, but cannot command trust without discipline. That distinction defined him. He had entered the underworld as a man certain of control. He returned as a man aware of limitation, and that awareness never left him. He became a caution more than a legend, not because he failed to reach the throne of death, but because he failed at the final measure of restraint. The descent proved his power. The turn revealed his fracture. Both truths lived side by side. That duality followed him everywhere. He had challenged finality and nearly reshaped it. Nearly. And in that single word, his entire story found its permanent boundary. He did not return to the underworld, yet he never fully rejoined the living. Something in him remained fixed at that threshold, where light and shadow divided. He continued to breathe, to walk, to play, but the certainty that once drove him had thinned into reflection. Obsession had propelled him into darkness with force. Reflection now restrained him in daylight. The difference between those two states defined the remainder of his life. He no longer played to persuade the world. He played to measure himself. Each note became examination rather than command. Where once he bent beasts and ferrymen, now he confronted memory and restraint. The music no longer reached toward the underworld. It turned inward. Obsession had sought to conquer structure. Discipline now sought to understand it. That internal shift marked the true aftermath of his descent. He understood that the underworld had not humiliated him. It had clarified him. Clarified the difference between devotion and possession, between courage and control. He had entered believing love justified any demand. He left knowing that love cannot override structure without consequence. That knowledge did not erase longing, it refined it. Longing remained, but stripped of the illusion that intensity alone could guarantee return. In quiet moments, he revisited the corridor in memory, not to torture himself but to understand it. The rule had not been cruel, it had been exact. Walk forward, trust the process. The condition required faith in movement without confirmation. That was the true test. Not love, not bravery. Discipline sustained through silence. In that silence, he had faltered. And in that faltering, he had learned the cost of needing to see before believing. He came to see that the gods had not denied him out of malice. They had offered him a narrow passage back to light, structured and fair. The path required restraint, not power. Power he possessed in abundance. Restraint he had never cultivated with the same intensity. That imbalance defined the outcome. Obsession drove him downward with certainty. Impatience brought him back alone. And that contrast became the permanent frame of his legend. He no longer described his descent as victory or defeat. He described it as exposure. Exposure of what he could command and what he could not. Music could shift stone, soften beasts, and draw attention from thrones carved in shadow. It could not silence doubt. That limitation altered him more than loss itself. He had confronted death and survived, but he had also confronted himself and recognized the boundary he could not cross. Over time, his story traveled farther than he did. People repeated the descent with admiration, the bargain with awe, the turning with sorrow. Few understood the precision of that moment. It was not dramatic chaos. It was measured hesitation, a fraction of uncertainty. That fraction outweighed every triumph that preceded it. And in that imbalance, his legend found its gravity. Not in how far he went, but in where he stopped. He accepted that the underworld had not rejected him. It had answered him. It answered with a condition clear enough to honor and simple enough to follow. His failure did not invalidate his love. It revealed its limits. Love propelled him downward. Discipline would have brought him back complete. That distinction became the quiet truth beneath his legend. Power can open gates. Only restraint carries you through them. He no longer tried to rewrite the ending. The corridor existed as it happened, unchanged by regret. That immovability became part of his discipline. He had once believed intensity could reshape outcome. Now he understood that outcome depends on structure honored without deviation. In turning, he deviated. That deviation cost him everything he sought to reclaim, and the permanence of that cost defined him more than the descent ever did. He carried the lesson quietly, not as bitterness but as measure of how thin the line can be between devotion and control, measure of how fragile certainty becomes when silence presses too long. The underworld had offered him a path shaped by restraint. He had answered with urgency. That exchange sealed the outcome. And in that sealed outcome, his legend took its final, unalterable form. In the end, what endured was not the image of him before Hades, nor the sound that moved stone and shadow. What endured was the turn. That single movement condensed his entire descent into one irreversible gesture. It proved that power can confront death, but cannot bypass discipline. He had reached the threshold of restoration. He had stood within reach of return, and in that reach, he demanded sight instead of trust. He understood that obsession had always carried a hidden condition of its own. It promises resolution, but it demands reassurance. The underworld had offered him resolution without reassurance. Walk forward. Do not look back. That was the entire structure. In breaking it, he exposed the dependency beneath his devotion. He did not fail because he lacked love. He failed because he could not endure uncertainty long enough to complete the passage. He no longer defined himself by the descent. He defined himself by the understanding that followed it. The corridor became symbol, not of tragedy, but of measure. Measure of patience against urgency, measure of trust against verification. He had verified and lost. That truth did not erase his love. It reframed it. Love without discipline becomes demand, and demand collapses under the weight of silence. The world remembered his courage more easily than his restraint. Courage is visible, restraint is silent, yet it was restraint that the underworld required and silence that he could not endure. That imbalance shaped everything that followed. He had confronted death with fearless intensity. He had been undone by a single glance born from uncertainty, and in that contrast, his story found its enduring tension. In time, the descent became legend, but the turn became lesson. He had walked where no living man belonged and forced the underworld to answer. Yet the true measure of that journey was not how far he went, but how precisely he faltered. One movement, born from the need to confirm, fractured the agreement entirely. Power carried him into darkness, impatience escorted him back alone, and that contrast defined him permanently. He came to accept that the gods had not tested his strength. They had tested his endurance within uncertainty. Strength he possessed in abundance, uncertainty he could not withstand without reassurance. That was the quiet axis of his failure, not weakness, not lack of love, but the inability to trust structure when silence offered no feedback. In that silence, obsession demanded sight, and sight destroyed completion. He no longer asked what might have happened if he had not turned. That question leads nowhere but deeper corrosion. Instead, he accepted the structure as it stood. The rule had been honored until it was broken. The consequence had followed without cruelty. That clarity became his discipline. He had once tried to control outcome through intensity. Now he measured himself through restraint, sustained without guarantee. The descent proved that love can confront death. The turn proved that love without discipline cannot complete what it begins. Both truths remained inseparable in his legacy. He was the man who entered the underworld alive and returned breathing. He was also the man who stood within reach of restoration and chose certainty over trust. That duality preserved his story from simplification and anchored it in consequence. In the end, he was not remembered only for the journey downward, but for the fragile moment that defined it. The corridor between shadow and light became symbol of the narrow distance between obsession and discipline. He had crossed realms no one dared approach, yet he could not cross a few final steps without turning. That tension, held between devotion and doubt, became the lasting structure of his name. He did not conquer death, nor was he defeated by it. He confronted it and learned where his power ended. His story endures not as romance, but as warning etched into myth. Obsession can open impossible doors. It cannot carry you through them without discipline. He reached the threshold, forced the impossible to answer, and lost everything in a single glance. The underworld remained unchanged. He returned, changed forever. And that irreversible change became his true legacy.